Give it a couple more minutes.
Okay.
Looks like there's 16 participants right now.
Cool.
Which is great.
Right on average, right on point.
All right, guys, you're live on Facebook and on Zoom, so whenever you're ready to go, I think we can get started here. Cool. All right, thank you.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm Peter Pearsall. I work in visitor services with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, mostly based in California and Oregon these days, but I'm going to be sort of the moderator of this presentation, which is titled Birding Through the Seasons in Your Yard and Abroad. And during this presentation, Ned Bohman is going to be giving the presentation, and throughout, I encourage folks to type in questions in the chat bar or in the Q&A sort of feature down at the bottom of the screen, and we will address questions as they come in. We'll find sort of moments in the presentation to pose questions to Ned. And just so everyone knows, this is being recorded and will be available on blackrockrendezvous.org later on after the presentation. So Ned Bohman is a project biologist with Great Basin Bird Observatory. He grew up in Connecticut and earned a BS in wildlife biology at the University of Vermont in 2012, after which he also worked as a park ranger for Vermont State Parks and traveled to work on conservation biology projects in Thailand, Alaska, and New Zealand. The beauty of the Great Basin drew him back to Nevada, where he now works on a variety of GBBO projects such as Pinyon Jay telemetry, surveys at Las Vegas Wash and Warm Springs, other Nevada bird count projects, bird banding, mortality surveys, and special species monitoring projects. And Ned, take it away.
All right, thanks, Peter. Like Peter said, I'm Ned Bohman with Great Basin Bird Observatory. I'm a project biologist and outreach coordinator. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you guys primarily about backyard birds, as it is a very relevant topic at the moment. But I'll also talk about some of the work Great Basin Bird Observatory does, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a really neat project that we've been working on in the Black Rock Range. So, let's get this going. Okay, so Great Basin Bird Observatory is a small nonprofit research group based in Reno. Our mission is to promote bird conservation through partnerships, education, and community. And we started back in 1997 when our director, Elizabeth Ammon, took the initiative to start the Nevada Breeding Bird Atlas, which was a massive undertaking across the entire state to document where birds were breeding and in what kind of numbers. And since then, we continue to monitor bird populations throughout Nevada and a few adjacent states. I've been here for 5 years, conducting surveys and coordinating outreach programs. Yeah, so before I get started talking about backyard birds, just a little bit about the work that Great Basin Bird Observatory does. One of our major projects has been monitoring the restoration work of the Nature Conservancy on the Truckee River. So they've been restoring the natural oxbows of the Truckee River since the late 90s. So we've been monitoring since the late 90s, and they started sometime before that. But they've been restoring natural oxbows and planting native vegetation and just trying to bring it back to a more wild state. So birds are a great indicator of environmental quality, and that's why they contacted us to do the surveys there. So we collect the data and share it with them, and they use that data to gauge the effectiveness of the restoration work they're doing. So monitoring is a huge part of what we do. We have a bunch of other monitoring projects. That's just a local example. We also do a lot of inventory surveys, and these are funded by a number of agencies, but in this particular example, our biggest one is funded by the Bureau of Land Management, and it's a statewide effort. They're randomly generated plots primarily in sagebrush habitat, and we also have a similar contract with the Forest Service that does the same thing, and we've been doing those since 2017, but we've been doing other inventories since long before that. So I mentioned a project that we worked on in the Black Rock Range. This started in 2016, and it's in the Black Rock Range and the Pine Forest Range, which are on the east side of the Black Rock Desert. And these surveys were in incredibly remote and rugged terrain, some of the most beautiful, pristine montane habitat I've seen in the state. And some of you may be lucky enough to know what I'm talking about. But the goal of this project was ultimately to improve stream quality in the Pine Forest Range to a point where a reintroduction project of the Lahontan cutthroat trout could be successful. So we established a series of control transects in the Black Rock Range in the Lahontan cutthroat trout wilderness study area, and a series of treatment transects in the Pine Forest Range, which is just north of that. The control transects had no cattle grazing, and the treatment transects did have grazing allotments. And the local ranchers, including those at Leonard Creek Ranch, were very interested in the bird community on their land and what effect their cattle grazing was having on that. In the interaction, all that played into the status of the Lahontan cutthroat trout. So they contacted BLM, and the forward-thinking, clever folks at the Winnemucca branch came up with the idea to use riparian riders, actual cowboys, to control how many cattle were grazing and where they were grazing. So this partnership just spawned some incredible results, and it's a really neat project that we're really proud to have been a part of. So this is just another photo of how beautiful that particular area is. This is at the crest of the Pine Forest Range, looking out over the Blue Lakes. And so, as I mentioned before, birds are a very useful metric for monitoring habitat, and that's why we became involved. So our goal was to determine the success of these riparian riders in the Pine Forest Range, if that could actually increase stream and habitat quality to a point that it would support Lahontan cutthroat trout. So this would be determined by comparing the bird communities in the two areas. The idea being that if the bird community in the Pine Forest Range were similar enough to that of the Black Rock Range, then it should theoretically be able to support Lahontan cutthroat trout. So as I mentioned, we began in 2016 and we continued surveys in 2017, 18, and 19. And the transects were surveyed 3 times during each of those years, once in May, June, and July. So the BLM is using our data to determine if the habitat in the Pine Forest Range is in fact, at a point where it would be suitable to attempt reintroducing Lahontan cutthroat trout. So they're still analyzing the data, and I do not have the results. All I can speak to is my firsthand experience of being out there and looking at the birds. And I will say that it definitely seems promising, and there are a lot of similarities between those two bird communities. But again, this was just an example of one of our projects and some of the partnerships we're involved with, and it's just a very, very neat thing to work with folks like that. So, in addition to our research, we also have been working on our community outreach and education program. So during normal times, we host a number of types of events around town. We attempt to host presentations, lectures, other type of events at venues around town that we work with. We also plan field trips and camping trips. That picture there was last summer. We had a bunch of folks out to the Ruby Mountains looking for the Himalayan snowcock. And yeah, everybody had a blast and it was a good time. Our most recent event was the Nevada Birdathon, which was a fundraising event we put together in which folks would set out to see as many species of bird as they could in a single day and collect pledges from people. But we had to sort of adapt this because of some changes in the social climate. So we added a backyard element to the Birdathon where folks could stay at home, and the contest then became who could see the most species of bird in their yard in a single 24-hour period. And that is sort of what led my train of thought to this presentation, made me realize how relevant this is right now. So without further ado, we'll get into backyard birds. So you may be familiar with some of these birds. These are some of the most common ones you're likely to see in your yard. The American robin in the middle there, the house finch at the top left, and the house sparrow with the black throat on the top right there. But there's a number of other species that frequent your ornamental trees, feeders, water features in your yard. For example, by the end of a year in Reno, I've seen as many as 50 species of bird in my yard. And this can be difficult to appreciate if you don't have binoculars or a bird feeder right next to a window, but they all make vocalizations which are unique to their species and can be identified and are beautiful in their own regard. So I'm just gonna play a couple clips here that you guys might recognize. So this is the song of the American. And this is the house finch. And this is the house sparrow. And so I imagine to the non-birders out there, those just sound like peeping and chirping. But to those of us who spend our time studying these are all highly unique and identifiable to the species the second you hear it. In addition to seeing them and hearing them, they leave evidence of their presence wherever they go. You've probably found feathers on the ground, this because they molt their feathers once or twice a year, depending on the species. You can also see nests, new nests, or old nests from previous years. And often these can even be identified to a particular species. In this picture here, you can't see it particularly well, and I had a really hard time finding a picture that did show it. But that's the nest of an American crow, and they're a species that frequently uses human objects in their nest. They decorate their nest with showy, flashy objects they find. So if you can see, there's actually some, it looks like tinsel or streamers or something in that nest. But big, messy looking stick nest up in a nice dense cluster of foliage with, yeah, shiny trash hanging out of it is almost 100% gonna be an American crow nest. There's also many other types of nest. Some species nest in cavities, which are just holes in the wild, they're holes in trees or holes in cliffs, but in your yard, they might be your birdhouse, or they might be a hole in your eave or your siding or something like that, which can be good or bad depending on your point of view. These cavity nests can often be identified by whitewash out front of the nest. And whitewash, I guess, is just a more pleasant way of saying that their poop is all over the place and very easy to see. So, you may think that the birds in your yard, when you see the same bird day after day, it's like, oh, look, there goes another scrub jay. But in fact, you'll see the opposite is true if you pay attention to them, that seeing the same bird day after day is a window into their life. It gives you the opportunity to see what that bird does day in and day out. Like, it's not just flying around visiting feeders. For example, this guy here, he's got a bill full of sticks, and that is nesting material. He's gonna bring that, or she is going to bring that to a nest. So if you see a bird in your yard with sticks in its bill, you watch where it goes, and it might lead you right to its nest. And then you have the opportunity to pay attention to that nest throughout the whole season, and you can watch it feed the babies, and you can watch the babies hatch and then fledge. So little things like that you can just key in on, and it's just a whole window into another world going on around you that so many people are unaware of. And now I know we do a lot of our work in remote, exotic seeming locations, but exciting bird watching doesn't have to happen in these remote places. Birds in your own backyard can be just as fascinating. That picture right there is an adult scrub jay, California scrub jay, feeding a juvenile California scrub jay. You know, I'm trying very hard to resist the cliche, more than meets the eye here, but it's true, you know, not just looking at the bird, but paying attention to what they do. You know, when you see it in your yard, you have that opportunity. When you're in a remote, distant location, you don't get to see that day after day. You see the bird was there. Okay, cool. In your yard, you know, this bird built a nest. This bird laid eggs. The eggs hatched and the kids fledged. And these baby birds were born in my yard. So they're doing different things throughout the year, which is another aspect that makes this so fascinating, is that it's always different. I'll introduce the word phenology here, which I'll touch back on later, and it'll be kind of the theme of the presentation, but that just means timing. So that's basically the behavior that they're doing at different times of the year, obviously beyond just flying around visiting feeders. So the timing is slightly different for each species, but in general terms, birds are migrating, breeding, and nesting in the spring. They're raising their young in the summertime. They're dispersing and migrating in the fall. And in the winter, they're preparing for next spring's migration. The reason it's not the same for all these species is mostly just because of differences in habit, differences in migration, really. Some don't migrate at all and are able to start nesting as early as March if the weather conditions permit. Other species have to make their way all the way back from wintering grounds as far away as South America and may not be here to start nesting until June. Some species migrate up into the mountains to breed and down into the valleys to spend the harsh winters, so they're not even a true long distance migrant. Species like this may stay in the mountains after they finish breeding until the first winter weather pushes them down into the valleys. Still others are total nomads, and they spend their winters following the food supply, not even necessarily visiting the same places year after year, and then they just nest wherever they find themselves in the spring. And sometimes if they're not in a suitable place, they'll skip a year and just keep traveling following the food supply. So yeah, I'm gonna make my way through the calendar here, and I'll just start in late spring since that's what we're in now. And I mentioned that it's gonna be different throughout the year what they're doing. So in late spring, you might notice the birds in your yard a bit more, and that could be for a number of reasons. You're having migrants come through, so there's actually more birds. And in addition to this, you're having the males begin to sing, which is something that they do in the springtime to claim their territory and attract mates. And obviously this singing makes them much more noticeable. Birds that have been here all winter, like great horned owls, may even have kids by this time of year. Others, like northern mockingbirds that also stay here all winter, they wait for it to be truly warm before they start nesting. And in May, species like this have probably just finished building nests and laying eggs, but migratory birds that have spent the winter here are mostly gone by May. Some may still be lingering. Birds that have spent their winter further south in warmer areas may have just arrived, and they're working on claiming their territories and starting to build their nests. In that picture right there, you can see a western kingbird in its nest. So they're a great example of a type of bird that's sort of just arriving and building their nest this time of year. And it's a great time to watch nest building because there's so much of it going on, and it's just can be very easy to see if you know what to look for. For example, that American crow flying into a thicket of branches with a big wad of tinfoil in its bill. Probably going to decorate its nest with that. Or that European starling that's flying into the crevice in your swamp cooler with a bill full of grasses. It's likely insulating a nest in there. And still other birds are just migrating through on their way to other destinations to nest. And you only see them for a few months of the year. For example, western tanager or black-headed grosbeak are a good example of birds like this. That'll
Hey,
just
Ned, I got
Yes.
a real quick question. Are there any
Sure.
migratory bird species still arriving in the Reno area?
Yes, there are. And actually, my next slide goes right into that. So I will just get that. So I don't have the photo of the yellow-billed cuckoo here, but yellow-billed cuckoo is a great example of a late arrival. They are typically not even setting up their territories until June. But for the most part, most species that are going to breed here have already got here, and they're already starting the process of building nests. So yeah, most of the birds will even have eggs close to hatching or hatched by now. The males won't be singing as actively now because they've already claimed their territory. They've already attracted their mate. It's just a waste of their energy to keep singing. This is the time of year when you will see them carrying food to their nests to feed their nestlings. Males will also be carrying food to incubating females that cannot leave the nest because they have to tend their eggs and brood over their young to make sure no nest predators sneak in or anything happens. But then once those eggs hatch, the male and female are both busily delivering food back and forth all day to those hungry nestlings. And again, that's another very easy behavior to observe in your yard, especially if you have a feeder and you see a bird visiting your feeder and disappearing into the same spot in the bushes. If you look closely, you might notice it's got a bill full of food every time it does that. And in some cases, it might even be the eaves of your house. In that photo there, I had the opportunity to have American kestrels nesting inside my house one year. Not actually inside, but there was a kestrel-sized hole in the siding. And so when we were sitting in the living room, we could watch them fly right in. And right there is the adult male with a big western fence lizard in his talons that he's carrying to the incubating female. And this was just such an incredible opportunity because in addition to seeing that, we learned that they have a specific vocalization they make when they bring food. And whenever we heard that vocalization, we knew to go watch out the window and watch the kestrel flying in with a snake in its talons to bring to the nest. And these are all photos that my friend took right out of our window. You could see the kestrel poking his head out there. And then you can see his fuzzy little nestlings right there. We were even lucky enough to be there the day that the kestrels left the nest. And so that on the left is one just about to leave. And then on the right, it is taking shelter underneath my friend's minivan. We watched it leave the nest and fly straight under the minivan for shelter. And it did leave before we had to go, before the van had to be moved. And so now we're into late summer and fall, and this is one of my favorite seasons for watching birds because you can see these fuzzy, clumsy, fledgling birds still learning how to be birds, following their parents around, begging for food. And this is very noticeable behavior, easy to observe, because not only are there a bunch of birds, but they're noisy. These fledglings will make the most annoying calls to get the parents' attention, to get them to feed them. And that's very, very obvious and easy to see. And so for some species, this marks the end of a successful breeding season and they're preparing to head south. But others that are going to stick around here all winter, they've got a few more months to hang out and they might attempt to have a second brood. House finches that I have in the picture here are a classic example of a bird that'll do 2 or even 3 in a year if it stays warm enough for long enough. Yet other species are already on the move on their way south. Some of the earliest fall migrants are rufous hummingbirds around here. And if you have hummingbird feeders in your yard, July is a great time to see rufous hummingbirds flying through. So nesting is the most energetically expensive thing a bird does in its life. And they spend a lot of time simply preparing for it, ingesting enough calories to make it all possible. And for species that migrate long distances, this energy drain is doubled by the migration. The long journey south is energetically expensive in itself, and it can be fatal for an undernourished or undersupplied bird. So for them, this time of year is a crucial time to restock these energy supplies that have been all but depleted during the nesting process. So keep those bird feeders stocked in the fall. Keep those birds arriving safely. And now that we're truly into the fall, migration will be in full swing again. And just quickly, that's a photo of a rufous hummingbird there. That looks like a young male or a female without the full red throat. Yeah. So in the fall, when your yard gets busy again with migrants coming through, you've got your warblers, tanagers, thrushes, and vireos flitting this way and that. They nested up in the mountains, and they're once again buffing up their energy stores in your yard on their way to Mexico or even South America. Those fuzzy, clumsy little house finches are now mostly independent adults, ready to disperse to their own new territory away from their parents. Fall migration often seems birdier than spring migration. Birdier in terms of there's actually more birds, because you're not only seeing the adults moving through, you're seeing their whole brood. Each pair of adults has 3 to 5, or if they've had 2 clutches, 6 or 7 kids following them. So there's a lot more birds heading south in the fall than are heading north in the spring. You may also begin to see some mountain birds coming downhill this time of year. The first cold storms will be pushing them downhill. And in fact, some of our most common winter residents here in Reno fit into that category. You may be familiar with white-crowned sparrows, yellow-rumped warblers, and ruby-crowned kinglets as birds in your yard. But if you pay attention, you will notice that they're only around in the winter months, and then once it hits spring, they're off to the mountains again. And now we're into late fall and early winter. Breeding season is done. Migrants are well on their way south or already at their destinations. Our winter residents are reaching their peak numbers right about now. Youngsters have left mom and dad's side and they're fending for themselves. Your feeder may seem busy during these colder months, and this is because songbirds have such a high metabolism. The smallest songbirds, like mountain chickadees that you can see in the picture there, they have to eat almost constantly to keep their body temperature up. And this is because of a principle called surface area to volume ratio. And it essentially means that the smaller a critter is, the harder it has to work to keep itself warm and energized. For example, humans, we generally eat 3 meals a day. We've got a large enough body size. We can retain that energy and slowly move those nutrients through our bodies. Whereas smaller animals, like it's true in mice as well as small birds, they burn through this energy much, much faster, and they don't have the body size to store it. So they're constantly eating to keep that body temperature up. So when you see that chickadee or kinglet at your feeder next time, you may have a new appreciation for just how important that meal is to that little guy. Now into the dead of winter. During the coldest months of the year, you may notice that the birds seem less active now that we're sort of settled into winter. And now they're doing everything they can to conserve their energy. They're doing it in these condensed periods, often feeding in rapid bursts and then returning to roost. And now I know you're probably thinking, hang on, you just said they need to eat constantly when it's so cold. So this is true, but there's also this unique ability of birds to actually lower their body temperature and slow down their metabolism. And this is called torpor. And it's how hummingbirds survive most nights, even in the summertime. So it also means that those chickadees and kinglets can eat in rapid bursts and take rests in between where they can slow down their metabolism, lower their body temperature, use less energy, and make that food they just grabbed go that much farther. Another big change in the wintertime is the vocalizations birds are making. So in the wintertime, you're hearing these little chip, sips, and peeps and little quiet noises, not the big showy songs you hear in the springtime. And this is because they're not trying to defend territory or attract mates in the wintertime. They're communicating with each other. They're checking in on excuse me, checking in on each other, saying, hey, I'm over here. Hey, where's Johnny? Or there comes a cat, watch out. So I'm just gonna play a couple calls very quickly to show what I mean. So these are white-crowned sparrows calling. And then this is a ruby-crowned king. So again, their vocal repertoire is incredibly complex. And for the most part, we think that these are location calls to figure out where they are. They are contact calls when they come into contact with each other. And they are warning calls when there's a threat in the neighborhood. And they're supposed to be subtle and not noticeable, only noticeable to their intended target, so that the cat that's targeting them doesn't hear them singing and warning people of it. Now we're starting to get warmer. By February and even January in some years, we know we're starting to get warmer days mixed in with the cold days here. And the earliest breeders are taking advantage of these warm days, while songbirds are still in their dead of winter routine. Larger birds with larger body sizes and larger abilities to retain energy don't have as much to risk if it suddenly gets cold again. And it's not really an if, it's a when, because February is early for that. But they have a much greater chance of surviving, whereas smaller songbirds, they don't really have this luxury. They need to wait until they're confident it's going to stay warm and not have a cold snap that's gonna take all their energy stores and potentially kill them. So great horned owls are a great example of a species taking advantage of these days. They're beginning to pair off and build their nests or refurbish their nests. I say refurbish because they will frequently reuse old nests. Once they've established a territory, they will frequently stay there for their entire life or return there if they do go somewhere.
Hey, Ned.
Yes.
There's a question about bird babies.
Sure.
Someone's asking, do the young come back to the area where they were born, or do they go elsewhere?
So that's something that scientists don't have a very firm understanding of. For the most part, yes, they do. There's a high degree of, we call it site fidelity, where they do come back to the same nest site year after year. I can give an example from a different project I worked on in Alaska, where we were color banding the birds we were working with. It was olive-sided flycatchers. We were color banding them so we could identify the individuals. And then in the following year, we would revisit that same territory. And you would see a bird in that territory, but it wouldn't have the color bands on it. So you know it's obviously a different bird than the one of the previous year. And we're generally assuming that it's because it's the offspring, but it's difficult to prove this unless you actually band the nestling, which is done in some cases, and that's how they have come to some of these conclusions. But it does seem like a lot of baby birds return to exactly where they were born. Scientists think that's one of the ways that one of the methods they use during migration is that it's sort of hardwired in their brain where they were born. So when they're on their way back north for their first breeding season, they've got this internal cue that's just pulling them in like a magnet to where they were born.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, but again, there's a lot of mystery around it because birds move and they fly and they migrate, and it's hard to keep track of individuals and which are the nestlings. So yeah, thanks. Great question. So, I was talking about great horned owls that frequently reuse their old nests. And when they do this, they'll add material to it. They call it decorating. And, but they don't always do this. They will often build new nests. But in general, winter can be a great time to see owls, as a lot of them are on the move following rodent populations. Some of those nomad birds I was talking about earlier are owls. And also there's a lot of species of owl that nest much further north than here, like northern Canada, and they come spend their winters in northern North America, like snowy owls that you can often see in New England and some of the northern parts of the western US. But yeah, the birds you're seeing in your yard may seem to vary a little more that we're getting some of these warmer days. because the birds that are nesting, that are short distance migrants, that are nesting in the mountains nearby, they're starting to return to their breeding habitats because it's not such a far journey. But then when we get those sudden cold days that inevitably come after the first warm days, those opportunistic birds get pushed right back down the mountain again, and they seek shelter in the warmth of the valleys and your yards again. And there are other birds that take advantage of this. Your feeder may be feeding more than just the birds you intend it to be feeding. On the left here, you have a northern pygmy owl, and on the right is a Cooper's hawk. And both of these are species that are known to exploit feeders in people's yards. Cooper's hawks are becoming more and more common in urban areas, and they just have that ability to adapt very well. And their body structure enables them to chase songbirds through the air and through obstacles very easily. They have short, broad wings and a long tail, so they have very powerful flight, but they also are very maneuverable in the air, which is exactly what you need to be if you're going to catch a little sparrow. And northern pygmy owls are another species that will stake out feeders looking for songbirds. And as their name suggests, they are very small owls. They are about the size of a robin. So they eat the smallest of small songbirds, but they are more frequently seen during the day, seen and heard during the day than a lot of other owl species, which is why I included them here, because they are also in that category that comes down from the mountains in the wintertime and moves back up to the mountains to breed and sort of follows the food around in that regard. And so I have a sound clip of the pygmy owl here that I'm just going to play quickly. So that's their advertising call. It's just sort of a slow, high-pitched hoot, and when you hear it, it kind of sounds like a cute little noise, like a tiny owl might be making. And now we're into early spring. Finally, the colder days and nights are yielding to sun, blossoming trees. Birds that spent the winter here are in various stages of breeding or heading for breeding grounds further north or further uphill. Those great horned owls that started nesting a few months back, they probably have nestlings that are about ready to fledge by now. This is maybe when you start to notice the birds around your yard a little more, as their, in some cases, very annoying songs can be hard to ignore. I'm sure some of you have had the experience of a northern mockingbird singing right outside of your window, which I did include here, and I can't remember which link it is, so here we go. So they're called mockingbirds because they imitate sounds that they hear in their environment and not always other bird sounds. But they're famous for unmated males singing late into the night and very early in the morning. And they can be particularly loud.
Hey, Ned.
Yes.
So these birds that you're seeing in your yard at this time of year, what's the typical sort of lifespan of, say, a house finch or a robin?
Yeah, so house finches and robins that stick around in the same place face different dangers than some of these longer distance migrants. So it's a lot more, it's harder to average their lifespan because they face threats like your neighborhood cats or flying into a very clean glass window that they don't even know is there. So barring accidents like that, they live for 5 to not quite 10 years. But then your longer distance migrants are, 5, maybe 7 years would be a really, really old for a warbler.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, great question. So this time of year, you've got birds that have been around here all winter, just waiting for the right opportunity to start nesting. They're singing their little hearts out. You've also got Lesser goldfinches is another common one here, which is the clip I started to play, and I will continue to play now. So these energetic little songs with those slidey whistles in there are pretty distinct of the Reno urban neighborhood. But this is a great time of year to watch them starting to build their nests and to sort of stake out their breeding territories. Watch for them carrying grasses or sticks and watch where they go. And they're bringing it to a nest. And if you're lucky enough to see it, you got that opportunity to follow it through the whole season. And it's just such a neat thing. And other species that aren't going to breed here that are lingering winter residents, like your white-crowned sparrows and your ruby-crowned kinglet and yellow-rumped warbler that I talked about a few slides back. They're lingering and fattening up at your feeders, getting fruiting trees, getting ready for their journey, or in some cases their move just uphill. And even the earliest migrants that are on their way north are starting to show up this time of year. For this area, turkey vultures and tree swallows are two of the first kind of harbingers of spring that I notice. But yeah, that sort of brings us back full circle, back to late spring. Yeah, I hope I was able to illustrate some of the diversity of the birds in your yard and explain some of the changes you're seeing over the course of the year. Throughout the year, they're constantly busy, overcoming struggles just to make it to the spring. Each year, they're taking on impressive odds to raise a brood. They face obstacles as they migrate, as they build nests, as they lay eggs, as they deal with late winter storms, as they avoid predators around the neighborhood. Sometimes it genuinely seems like a miracle that a bird as small as the black-chinned hummingbird is able to migrate that far from central Mexico for winter to as far north as Washington State to breed in the summer, and is still able to successfully raise kids after that long journey. This species also nests in Nevada, and if you have a hummingbird feeder, you may be familiar with them, but they're pictured right there on the lower left side. And that's a nice adult male with the purple chin and that contrasting white throat that gives them a nice sharp look. But yeah, next time you see that bright yellow lesser goldfinch at your feeder, stop to appreciate its struggle as it makes it through winter storms, avoids the cats and Cooper's hawks, and manages to consume enough calories to make it another year, to raise another brood despite the odds. So as you're watching birds out your window, maybe you'll notice some changes in the ones you see, in the ones you see at different times of the year. I've got a bit more about birding resources and things like that, but I imagine folks might have some questions about yard birds. It might be a good time to take those.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions here. Someone's wondering about, there's a pair of house finches that work diligently on a nest outside of their front door, but they seem to have moved on, and they're wondering why didn't they want to stay?
So house finches are an interesting species, and they're a very opportunistic nester, and they also nest very, very early in their lives. So you get a lot of inexperienced birds trying to place nests in places that are not necessarily ideal for a nest. So each specific situation is different, but I was thinking about this species actually just this morning, in that it's a common species that I see failed nests in the springtime. And I think it's just because they're opportunistic risk takers, and sometimes that risk pays off and sometimes it doesn't. In the case of your birds, that it seems like they just took off without kids hatching, the nest could have been predated. Squirrels are nest predators, their cats will be nest predators. There's a lot of reasons a nest could fail and the birds would leave, but generally when the nest fails, they'll move to a new location, sometimes right next door or sometimes miles away, to try again.
Great, thank you. We got one more question here.
Sure.
In your work, have you seen a shift in the timing and the range of bird migration because of light pollution and global warming?
It's tough to say because there's so much variation from year to year, given the different, if we have a stronger winter It's gonna be a slower start to spring. So it's tough to say with all the variability. You'd need much longer term data than I have from my personal experience to make judgment calls like that. You know, it's a tough thing to observe on a level like that, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
For sure. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I believe that's it for right now.
All right, cool. Well, I just wanted to talk about a few things for right now. It seems like folks are getting a little bit more keen about bird watching, and so I wanted to provide a few helpful tips for folks that are just getting started. So a couple of my favorite field guides I mentioned here. I really like David Allen Sibley's field guides. He has one for Western North America, he has one for Eastern North America, and he has one for all of North America. And it's a great book with great illustrations, great field marks. It's very useful, and I generally don't go bird watching without my copy in my backpack. The National Geographic Field Guide is also really good. And I picked both of these two because they use illustrations as opposed to photos in them, which I find to be more useful when you're starting, because the illustration can capture the variety within a species, whereas the photo is just a specific individual that could have an anomaly going on with it. And then at the bottom there, I have a link about selecting binoculars. I think that article that I have there is geared more towards kids, but there's a ton of resources out there for selecting the best binocular for where you are, because it's not necessarily a straightforward process and it's an expensive investment, so you want to do it right. All right, and then I've got just two more here. I wanted to plug eBird by Cornell because it's a fantastic resource. That it's basically a huge map-based, for those of you who don't know, a huge map-based citizen science database where people report bird sightings. You do need to create an account to report sightings, which is free, but you don't need an account to look up bird sightings. So you can go to ebird.org and you can search. There's great tools to search by location or by species, so you can see what other people are seeing in your area, or if there's a species you want to see, you can look up where you're most likely to see it. But also, it's just incredibly useful to actually submit data to this for scientists who are often underfunded and they don't have the funding to conduct research across the whole range of a species. They have their study area, so they go on eBird to look up observations from the whole range, and this can be very useful in making conservation decisions. So citizen science programs like these are just fantastic. And then that last thing is just a really neat book about birds, and it's called Suburbia by John Marsloff. And it's just a really neat book about birds in the suburban areas and how the different species have adapted in different ways and how some have been unable to adapt, and sort of the differences in these strategies and why this may be. But yeah, that's kind of all I wanted to say.
We have a couple more questions that came in, Ned.
Sure.
Lori is asking about where she can find more information about other talks or walks about birds in Nevada, and wondering whether GBBO hosts bird walks.
Yes, we host bird walks during normal times. We are still kind of on hold for that right now, but you can check out our website at gbbo.org. We are also on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, but there's if you're located in Reno, there's the Lahontan Audubon chapter that hosts bird walks, and they do a lot of great things with the community. And there's another Facebook page called, I think it's called Birding Nevada, and that's a really great resource, and we work with them a lot too.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah,
and then
sure.
One more question here. Kevin's asking about scrub jays that showed up in the backyard, and now there are crows there as well, and the songbirds and cedar waxwings don't show up anymore. Is there a way to get the noisy corvids to leave and the songbirds to return?
Yeah, that's tough because your corvids are just so stinking smart. They're just very, I'm guessing you have a feeder, and that's probably what's attracting them. Whereas your cedar waxwings are eating berries, and they're going to be more attracted to water features and things like that, where your corvids are incredibly opportunistic and will take advantage of whatever bird feed you're putting out there. So again, it's all very situational, and it's tough to say exactly what the cause may be, but you can encourage other birds to show up by adding these water features. Nectar feeders can be really good for more than just hummingbirds. You know, you can attract orioles and grosbeaks and tanagers with the nectar feeders. Fruiting shrubs and trees can be really good for a lot of these species. But at the end of the day, nature kind of does what nature does, and it's hard to control.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Ned, for the presentation. That sounds like it's all of the questions. I want to let folks know that starting at 6 p.m. is an astronomy presentation with people from the Fleischmann Planetarium, and they can find the link on blackrockrendezvous.org. There are 2 more nights of programming, and you can find all the details of the programs available on blackrockrendezvous.org. And if people aren't already, they should consider donating or becoming members of Friends of Nevada Wilderness, Friends of Black Rock High Rock, and or the Nevada Outdoor School. I think that concludes our presentation.
Great, thanks, Peter.
Thank you.